toothpaste on my face. Hello, everybody. Anybody there? Check that out for a cover. This is Stanley Clarke, virtuoso bass player. He was played with Paul McCartney. He played with all sorts of kind of fusion groups. I picked this record up a couple of weeks ago now at Outside Records, and it's called Rock, Pebbles and Sand. I'll show you the it's got in a, oh, look at this, got some nice pictures. Hello Richard, how are you? You okay? Bored shitless was the word you just used to describe yourself, I believe, on Facebook. It's on the Blue Epic label. This album is pretty terrible. There's a weird thing that goes on. I mean, I'm not a big expert in fusion music, you know, rock, jazz, fusion, but they seem to occasionally try to do sort of commercial stuff. This album, there's some really dodgy kind of love songs, you know, kind of like, I don't know whether they were sort of influenced by late 1970s Genesis or something, but they just try to get all kind of soppy and just, they do these awful ballads. It's quite sad really, because these guys are such incredible musicians, and you just want to hear them just doing their stuff, and yet they keep sort of lapsing into these terrible. Hello, David. I've bought 2 chickens, not bored now. Very good. 2 chickens. That's interesting. We thought of getting some chickens a few years ago. I think there was even some talk of buying some pigs, but we didn't actually go through with it. Okay, so I'm not going to do a particularly long stream today. I was just a bit bored. Hello, John. How are you? You all right? I thought I'd do a little theme today of solo albums. I've pulled some off the shelf, so I'll just kind of show some stuff, and people can either talk about what I'm showing, or they can just talk about other crap. Hello, Alan. How are you? Right. So yeah, some of these are, you know, fairly well known. Some of them are quite obscure. Some of them are kind of halfway in between. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and some of them are great. This one is an interesting record. Anybody know this one? This is Bob Welch and French Kiss. Now, Bob Welch was the guitar player in Fleetwood Mac in the early 1970s. He was from that period of Fleetwood Mac where it was after Peter Green left, but before Stevie Nicks and Lindsay joined, and it's sort of known as their lost period. William says hello too. He's watching your videos for the first time. Hello. Goodness me, we've got a nice diverse set of people. Richard, David, John, Alan, Calm. Wonderful stuff. Yeah, so Bob Welch was the guitar player in Fleetwood Mac during the sort of lost period. It's the period where they weren't really selling any records, and they'd stopped being a pure blues band, and they were trying to make their way, but not really doing all that well. And he left the band obviously before the real big, you know, commercial period. And he went off and he made this solo record, and apparently the other members of Fleetwood Mac really hated it. I bought it a while ago thinking it was going to be this kind of strange, edgy kind of record, but it actually sounds like an early 1970s Fleetwood Mac record. It's got kind of elements of soft rock, yacht rock as well. But there's a certain atmosphere to this record which kind of makes it quite interesting. Hello, Sean. Good morning. I think it's because he recorded most of the instruments himself. I think it's maybe just him and a drummer. And there's a certain kind of slightly, I don't know, it's hard to describe the atmosphere on this album. It's yacht rock, but it's ever so slightly, there's a sort of woozy kind of, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it. It just sounds like somebody totally vanishing into their own world in a way, you know, and completely ensconcing themselves in a recording studio. It's just a great kind of classic 1970s solo album, I suppose, by a reasonably obscure cult musician. And it does actually have a couple of members of Fleetwood Mac on it. I think it's got, I'm not sure who it's got. I think it's got Christine McVie on it and a couple of other people. 1977. Anyway, it's worth hearing it. All right, David's wanted me to do another record grab. I don't need to this morning, David. I've got a huge pile of records to show you. So let's just whip through what I've got, and maybe at the end we can see what else I can find. Right, John, if you're still with us, this is one for you, John Downing. This is Roger Taylor from Queen, and this is his album Fun in Space. Buggy then, David says. Sorry, David. Hello, Michael. Michael B. Gallagher, the media preacher. How are you? Yes, I am very well in this crisis. Thank you, David. Just showing some classic solo albums and perhaps some less classic ones as well. This is Roger Taylor from Queen. This is a solo album he made in, what year was this? 1981. I'm just going to close the blind because we've got a bit of, actually, no, I'm just going to leave it. Now, I could be wrong in saying this, but I think Roger Taylor was possibly the first member of Queen to make a solo album. Is that right, John? I know in the Bohemian Rhapsody movie, there was all this bullshit about how it was Freddie Mercury had wanted to branch out and get into a solo career, and it was seen as being a great betrayal, and, you know, the other members of Queen were absolutely horrified. But I think in reality, I think Brian May and Roger Taylor had both done solo albums before Freddie. You know, Queen were an interesting group in that all four members wrote songs. Roger Taylor was he was a bit slow out of the gate. He wrote a song on every album from the first album onwards, but he was the last person to get a hit with one of his songs. You know, John Deacon was already writing hits by the time of Night at the Opera. He wrote You're My Best Friend. And obviously, Freddie and Brian were writing big hits right from the get-go. Roger had to wait until, I think it was Radio Gaga was his first hit, which was from 1983, 84, something like that. But he'd always been a songwriter, and the stuff, yes, The Cross, Sean, yes, that was his band, wasn't it, in the 80s, when he tried to actually become a singer and a guitar player. So he hired a drummer, and he was the front man. He was a very talented guy, really. And the stuff that he wrote for Queen, it was always, I think out of all of them, he was the most influenced by new wave music. You know, he had the song Sheer Heart Attack on New to the World, and he had a couple of good new wavy type songs on the Jazz album. I think I'm going to try and pull this blind down a bit because it is very, very bright here. I've got the sun shining today. I've got this very translucent blind, which doesn't particularly do a very good job. Anyway, this was the album that he made. Like I said, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, 1981. So this would have been after the game. I don't think it did anything commercially for him, but, you know, quite a cool record. And there's definitely something to be said, I think, for drummers who turn out to be great songwriters and singers, because we drummers don't get a great press. I don't know the second album, John. What was that called? Fun in Space. What was this second solo album called? Don't remember. Anyway, so who have we got here? Tim Jones. Hello, Tim. Yes, well, you've got to be in the mood to do live streams. I was nearly not in the mood this morning. I've been in a slightly strange mood for the last couple of days, just not being able to settle to anything. You know, it's hard, isn't it, when you're stuck in the house all the time. Dennis Wilson, great drummer with an amazing solo album. Yes, Michael, you're quite right about that too. I don't have Pacific Ocean Blue on vinyl. Who's that you're referring to there, Richard? Top of the Pops doing Future Management. Is that Roger Taylor you're referring to there? Strange Frontier, that's right. Yes, thank you. Okay, here's another one. This is Tom Verlaine, and he was from Television, of course. This is his album Flashlight, which came out in 1987. I picked this one up from Sheffield maybe a couple of years ago from a charity shop, and it's a really, really good album. There's a fantastic song on this record called The Scientist Writes a Letter, After you've done with me watching me, go and check out that song. It's got the most incredible guitar solo on it. Real kind of, don't know, just very, very intense. Just a really, really great guitar solo. It sounds like television. I mean, it does sound like classic television. Nice album, 1987. Tom Verlaine's solo stuff. It's the kind of stuff that you'd think would be quite rare and quite hard to get hold of. But I do see his records around, and they tend to be not very expensive. It's one of those sort of curious things that go on where you think that a particular artist, you think, television, Tom Verlaine, a real cult name. So you'd think a record like this would be kind of like, £150 or something if you found it. Whereas in fact, you can get his albums for £8. But that's a really, really nice record. And the song in question that I mentioned is called "The Scientist Writes a Letter." Really interesting song. It's really slow. It takes the format of a guy writing a letter to a girl, I think, who's dumped him, and it builds and builds gradually, and then it goes into this just absolutely immense guitar solo at the end. What's this, David? Queen's bass player Barry Mitchell used to play in my pub with Hugh Grundy of the Zombies. Is this the Queen's bass player before John Deacon, David? Hello, Tim. Yeah, I've got one Colin Hay solo album on CD, which is quite nice actually. It's just him and acoustic guitar. Yeah, he does quite a few gigs in the UK. I almost went to see him. He was playing at the Small Room at the Manchester Academy a few years ago, and I almost went along to see him, but I didn't. I used to love Men at Work. In the 80s, I had an older cousin who was really, really into them, and he turned me on to the Cargo album. I love Overkill by Men at Work. I always kind of thought of them as the Australian Squeeze, really. Right, let's do this big monster. This is All Things Must Pass. So what can we say about this record? This is just a beast, really, isn't it? This is one of the ultimate solo statements by an artist. You'd be hard pressed to find another kind of textbook case of a guy from a band who hadn't really found a way of properly getting his outlet going. He was so pushed into the shadows by Paul and John, I guess, and it's difficult to credit, isn't it, that even as late as Abbey Road he was only getting 2 songs per record. And when you look at how good those 2 songs are, you think, well, why on earth was there not more space for him to do stuff? And then he described this record as the act of going to the toilet, having spent years constipated, which is quite an apt metaphor, really, because it was this great kind of outpouring of just amazing songs, really. And he worked on them with Phil Spector, David, John Deacon, pre John Deacon, but not Smile. Yeah, the kind of early days of Queen are not particularly well documented, are they? I know John Deacon was the last member of the band to join. I didn't know anything about the previous bass player, Barry Mitchell. I know, Michael, it's hard to find All Things Must Pass at an affordable price. I mean, it's such a massive beast of a record, and I've still yet to this day listened to the 3rd disc. I keep meaning to do a video where I just basically listen to the Apple Jam record and properly get into it. I don't know. It's got such a dreadful reputation, hasn't it? But anyway, John Lennon apparently was not too impressed with this record. He didn't like the cover. He said that George Harrison looked like a garden gnome in his wellies, and I think it must have come as a bit of a shock, really, to Paul and John that George just came out of the gate with this really kind of immense album, and it was a big hit as well, Right, this next one, this is Robert Plant and Manic Nirvana. Now, this came out in 1990. I'll show you the inside of this one. This is a limited numbered edition. I picked this up when it first came out, and it's got a fantastic gatefold. Look at that hair. Jeez. Now, this was an interesting record because when Plant left Zeppelin, he wanted to have a complete departure, really, and he didn't want to go down that Zeppelin route of doing big, kind of loud rock albums. Although his first record, Pictures at 11, was fairly Zeppelin-y in places. He had Cozy Powell on drums, and But then he did a couple of albums where he went definitely down. Well, 2 or 3 albums where he went into that whole world of sequencers and samplers, and I think he was quite influenced by people like Ultravox and sort of that kind of early 80s thing. And then he did an album called Now and Zen, which I think was 87, and Jimmy Page turned up on that as a guest. And then he just decided just to do this incredible kind of Zeppelin return in 1990. He just came out with this absolute kind of balls to the wall, golden rock god kind of record, and it's got a very sort of 90s sound to it. The drums are quite clattery, but there's some real big pumping guitar anthems on this record. Check out the song Tie Dye on the Highway, which is an absolutely brilliant song. I used to have that on a cassette in the car back in the 90s, and I used to just blast it all the time. It's got a real kind of heavy, grinding sort of guitar riff in it, and it's got a great Woodstock sample at the start of it, and it's pretty immense stuff, really. Like I said, it's got a kind of dated 90s sound, early 90s, late 80s sound to it, but it's definitely the Zeppelin record that Plant was always destined to make after he left Led Zeppelin. That's Manning Nirvana. Have I missed any chat? Nope, nobody's saying anything. That's fine. Okay, one for you, Richard McCook. This is Boulders by Roy Wood. This is an original pressing from whatever year it came out. Was it 1973? Although he'd recorded it a couple of years before, I think. I've been getting back into this again recently on my iPod, courtesy of Richard. Thanks, Richard, because Richard gave me some MP3s. So this is a fantastic album. I've got no other words to say, really. It's just, Roy Wood, just a great genius. A true solo album, Richard says. Absolutely, yeah. There are a few kind of auteur songwriters in rock history. You're thinking Todd Rundgren, you're thinking Stevie Wonder. Paul McCartney did a couple, but nobody did it quite with the panache that Roy Wood did it. I mean, this album, he covers all styles. He does rock and roll music, he does power pop, he does weird kind of acid folk stuff, and the vocal harmonies that he does, and he does all this kind of stuff with like various speed vocals where he'll do a particular kind of voice, but then he'll speed it up and then he'll double track it, and you think, God, it sounds like nothing on earth, really. He was really influenced by Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. He did a record later in the 70s called Mustard, which was much more Beach Boys influenced. This one is more kind of, it's more like the stuff he did on Shazam by The Move, really. I think this record was done at about the same time as Shazam, maybe, or maybe it was a bit later than that. And it's just one of those records that should be much more well-known than it is. It's just got some fantastic songs on it. There's a brilliant medley towards the end of side 2, which really puts Paul McCartney's medley to shame. The one he did on Red Rose Speedway, Rocking Shoes, She's Too Good For Me, Locomotive. And it's just the standard of musicianship that he was able to demonstrate. He played all these instruments, bassoons and bagpipes and just all kinds of mad stuff. And he was brilliant on every instrument as well, really. Not technically brilliant, but he was a very instinctive musician who could just, he could give you a tune on the bagpipes, he could give you a tune on the mouth organ. He was just, it's difficult to see, really, why his career sputtered out in the way that it did. Because he did Wizard, and they sort of went bankrupt, really, because the records cost so much money to make that in the end he had to fold that operation, and he never really made a comeback. He was never able to come back into the charts, really. And Roy has had no success in the pop charts probably since about 1974, which just seems crazy to me, really. He should have been an absolute legend. But there you go. I suppose he's got the Christmas record to keep him in mince pies, hasn't he? Let's have a look and see. David, Roy Wood, Music to Commit Suicide To is the best B-side ever. I know, it's a great song. Tim, right. I do have a Roger Waters album in the pile, but not that one. Let's just see if I can dig it out for you. I've got these in no particular order. Let's see where it is. Oh, I thought it was in here. Here we go. I pulled this one out, actually. This is Radio Chaos. This is my original copy from 19... I'm not sure, 80, was it 86, 87, something like that? What do we think of Roger Waters' solo work? Here's a confession. I've never listened to Amused to Death, you know. Never heard it. I'm not massively into Roger Waters, really, as a kind of solo artist. I'm not really into David Gilmour either, really. I think, you know, Pink Floyd were one of those bands where you sort of, I felt like you had to have them both, really. You know, Roger's stuff could be very acerbic and very bitter, angry, twisted, quite hard to listen to. But then David Gilmour's stuff is very soporific. It's just all based around string bending and kind of, I don't know, that kind of ambient soundscapey stuff, which gets a bit fluffy after a while, it gets a bit nebulous. If you put the two together, you get stuff like, you know, Run Like Hell on the Wall, for example, or Comfortably Numb is the great example, where you've just got that great lyric melded to this brilliant tune, and then you have this absolutely incredible guitar solo, you know. But I don't know, I can take or leave them, really. And this album, this was, where's it gone? This album was a real kind of mad, strange conceit. It was set in a Welsh coal mining community, and it had a kind of some sort of World War III simulator thing going on, and there was an American DJ in it. It was one of those real classic kind of disjointed concept albums where you just think this is a rock star who has just gone off completely into his own little world, where he thinks that any kind of mad, outlandish concept that he thinks of is going to work as a rock record. It's probably a bit sort of, you know, Pete Townsend influence, really. Yeah, talking to Pete Townsend, I meant to pull a couple of his records off the shelf and I forgot. Right. Hello, Gavin. Gavin Johnson. Take or leave him. Yeah, absolutely, Gavin. Yeah. David, I would love to have seen Nick Mason's Source Full of Secrets. I was pig sick when it turned out that he was playing sort of, you know, biggish venues, because he did a couple of smallish shows in London. And I thought to myself, wow, if he's going to come around the north playing, you know, that size venue, it would be absolutely amazing. But he ended up, I think he was playing Manchester Apollo, and I don't like those kind of venues, really. You know, you can't park the car, there's bouncers everywhere, and, you know, beer on the floor, sticky, horrible. No, I didn't go. I'd love to have seen that tour. Would have been absolutely fantastic. Right, let's just keep moving on. This is a classic. I don't know if John is still with us, 6-inch pianist, but this is one that he might appreciate. This is Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy. This is his album Solo in Soho. This is the one that's got Yellow Pearl on it, which became the Top of the Pops theme, didn't it, in the 80s? And it's quite a nice record, this. This was in my local Oxfam. I think was it last year or the year before? And it was one of those ones where I kept seeing it. It was in the racks. It was priced at about maybe £5, and I kept leaving it there for some reason. You know, I'd go back and it would still be there, and I'd go away, leave it, come back. Nobody was picking it up, and I was thinking to myself, why do I keep leaving this record? You know, it's obviously something that's going to be worth having. So I finally grabbed it, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's a strange album. It's not really anything like Thin Lizzy. It's more of a kind of early 80s pop album. And I suppose it makes you wonder what quite was going through his mind. I mean, it's got a good cover and everything. I mean, you know, that almost could be a Thin Lizzy album cover, couldn't it? But it was definitely him kind of branching out and trying to do something different. This was 1980. When did he die, Phil Lynott? Do we know when he died? It probably wasn't that long after this. And I don't actually know if he made any more Thin Lizzy albums after this, or whether he'd actually left Thin Lizzy at this point and it was just going solo in Soho. But anyway, quite a nice record. You know, it's probably like 7 out of 10. Yellow Pearl is different to the single version, Richard. Yeah, you're probably right. Couldn't swear to that, but all right, David, a double LP of a gig is available fully signed from, this is Nick Mason you're talking about. Okay, I shall check that out. That sounds intriguing. Another one for you, Richards. This is Ian Hunter. Now, this record, I've been after a good copy of this for a long time. Kept seeing it around. There was always something wrong with it. Ripped covers or, you know, dodgy scratches. But I picked this one up a while ago from my local antique centre, and just one of the great album covers of all time, isn't it? Let's get it out of here so we can see it. Look at that. That is the dog's bollocks, isn't it? And on the back, I always thought he looks like Tom Baker's Doctor Who, doesn't he, on the back of there? Not sure if that was deliberate or not. Ian Hunter. The Mott the Hoople albums are, I think they're quite difficult to come by in the UK. In good condition anyway. And I don't know how many solo albums Ian had. And I don't know a lot about him. I mean, I enjoy that album. But, you know, I wouldn't describe myself as a big fan of Mott the Hoople. And, you know, I don't particularly know Ian Hunter's music beyond this record. But that is a good album. And I love the cover. What are we talking about now? Johnny Thunder's first solo album. Jermaine Greer, absolutely. Yeah, Alan, you're right. Yeah. I can't remember who it was, but Tom Baker's visual style in Doctor Who, it was based on either a particular person or a particular kind of image that had been around in the 20th century, maybe coming from France or somewhere, but it was based on that sort of bohemian kind of outline of a person with a long coat and a scarf. I think it was meant to be quite kind of bohemian European, you know. Ian Hunter's about 84 now, David says. I thought he was dead. Actually, no, that was Mick Ronson I was thinking of, sorry. Oh, Phil Lynott, not Ian Hunter, Kevin says. Right, okay, so Phil Lynott played on Johnny Thunder's first solo album, okay. Yeah. He was also on War of the Worlds, wasn't he? Fantastic performance on that record. Okay, let's move on. This is Peter Gabriel, his first solo album from 77. This contains his brilliant song, Salisbury Hill. And it was the first of, was it 3 or 4 albums where he called every album Peter Gabriel? It was just one of those great perverse kind of things where he just wanted every album just to be given the same name. I just love the cover of that record. It's this something so iconic about it. The ghostly kind of picture in the windscreen and just the water on the bonnet. Love it. When I first heard this record, which is, you know, many years ago, it wasn't really what I was expecting, really. You know, it's produced by Bob Ezrin, and it's got quite a kind of boomy, clattery sound to it in places. Although Salisbury Hill does not have that sound, but there's some fairly big kind of, you know, bombastic rock tracks on this album. It's not necessarily what you'd think Peter would want to do after leaving Genesis, because he wanted to escape from the sort of, you know, the kind of corporate machinery of arena rock with Genesis. And then, you know, the first album he made was actually it was a fairly kind of big rock kind of style. It had Robert Fripp on it, of course. Yeah, nice album. Should get it on CD, really. Oh, what time are we on? Let's have a look. The clocks have gone forward, haven't they, today? Yes, David, you're probably right, actually. Yeah. I wonder which elderly rock stars are going to be swept away by COVID-19. Bit of a sobering thought, isn't it? We have Lou Reed. This is a fantastic album. This is one of these sort of underrated ones, I think. Wells. Anyone know this one? 1979. It's got a very kind of twisted, messed up sort of New York sound to it. Disco Mystic is a kind of, I don't know, just a sort of churning disco song with horns. It's a very, very sleazy album. I don't know, it's not one that particularly ever gets talked about or mentioned. I think Lou Reed quite liked it. I think it was an album that he was quite pleased with. And it pioneered some kind of new sound technique that he was working on, stereo binaural sound recording. Not quite sure what that was all about, but it's got a very kind of dark, intense sound. All Through the Night, Richard says. Yeah, absolutely. The second to last track on this record, yeah. Okay, Richard, the best solo Genesis album is Phil Collins's Face Value. Okay. Yeah. Do I have a copy of that? I need to check. And the answer appears to be no. No, I did have all of his records at some point, but I think I purged myself of them, I think. And I've got nothing against Phil Collins at all. You know, I like the Phil Collins era of Genesis, but I didn't get too into his solo stuff. Oh, I do have this. Look at this. This is the CD single of Another Day in Paradise. It's one of those little tiny CDs that you used to be able to get, and I used to really love this. Look at that. I just like the B-side, Heat on the Street. Good song, that. This came from the period when he was really, really hated during this period. It was that period where that remark was ascribed to him. I'm not sure if it was actually true, but he said something like, if the Tories win the next election, I'm going to go and become a tax exile. And it came out, he said that, he was meant to have said that at the same time as this song came out. And this song obviously is about, you know, the need to give to charity and the need to be supportive of people. And somehow this comment came out and everybody thought that he'd said it, but then in later years he said that he'd never said that, and it was either made up completely or it was, you know, out of context, whatever, you know, just like a misquote. But Phil Collins became deeply, deeply unpopular in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. I think it started with Live Aid, really. I think when he did the 2 appearances at Live Aid, he really started to overexpose quite badly, I think, and he was just absolutely everywhere. Calm, do you like Steve Hackett's solo? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I almost pulled one out here somewhere. Let's have a look and see where we are here. Got him here somewhere, Calm. So many records. Too many. Oops. This is my inbox. Sure, it's here somewhere. This is the last one I picked up by Steve. Voyage of the Acolyte. Let's have a look. Now, what do we think of that picture? What do we think of that? Is that good or is it pretty bad? You know, I don't have much artistic sense. Yeah, Steve Hackett. He's one of those musicians who has managed to weather the storms of critical, whatever you want to call it, critical credibility. He got out of Genesis probably about the right time, in a way, just when the punk thing was about to break, and he went off to do a solo career that was pretty kind of tasteful, really, and he did a lot of albums which, quite wisely, I suppose, focused on his instrumental technique, and he's just an amazing musician. I mean, he was never remotely fashionable, but I don't think he ever particularly kind of raised the ire of the punk brigade, because he just went quite small scale, and he plays sort of medium-sized venues now. But it's quite interesting because, Genesis have just announced that they're going to reform, with a classic three-piece, and they're going to do this big kind of, clean-up tour. And there's loads and loads of Genesis fans online, sort of, older in the tooth fans, who are basically saying, I'm not going to pay £300 to go and watch the three-piece Genesis, but I would definitely pay maybe £50 to go and see Steve Hackett playing at the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester, And it's quite interesting to consider how different the two, because I think he is on tour, isn't he? Or he's planning a tour. It's interesting that the two concerts are going to have extremely different audiences. You're going to have that massive mainstream audience who kind of lapped up all the 80s Genesis stuff, but those people probably have got no idea about the early Genesis. And then if you go to the Steve Hackett concerts, you're going to find people who are really, really heavily into 1970s Genesis, but who wouldn't go anywhere near a kind of 80s style Genesis reunion. Yes, Alan, I do have a solo album by Anthony Phillips, which was actually sent to me by Sean, who may well be on here. I couldn't pull it though, because it's in the living room on a shelf, and my son's in there at the moment, so I couldn't go and grab that one. Anthony Phillips's stuff was very, I don't know why, discreet sounding, understated, almost sort of so quiet and understated that it almost vanished into the ether. You have to just crank up the volume and just put headphones on. It was almost like he didn't want to offend anybody. It was just the quietest, most unassuming music you could ever imagine. Which is quite appropriate, I suppose, given that he left the band because he had chronic stage fright, didn't he? And the music he went on to make, it was so sort of quiet and English and unassuming. Hello, Rob. I would much rather see Steve Hackett than pay £300 for a reunion concert. Absolutely, yeah. Richard, Ecstasy is the one I really do rave on about. Absolutely, I love Ecstasy by Lou Reed. Yeah, my favourite song off that record is called Tatters. Brilliant. John Cale. See what's going on with this. This is his album Slow Dazzle from '75. This is one of the albums he made for Island Records in the mid-1970s. It came after, Fear. I think so, anyway. And it has got Phil Manzanera on it, Chris Spedding as usual. This is a fantastic album. I love this. It's got a track called The Jeweler on it, which has to be heard to be believed, really. It's one of Cale's kind of strange, surreal spoken word things. It's this really weird story about a guy who gradually changes into a vagina. But it's a strange sort of iridescent vagina with sparks flying off it. It's really, really, really strange. But this album has also got his version of Heartbreak Hotel on it, which is one of the great kind of unhinged performances of Cale's career. He was pretty messed up in the 1970s, John Cale. He was an alcoholic. I think he was addicted to coke and, various things. He was living a very, very rackety life. He worked as an A&R man for Island Records and was living in London in this sort of squalid basement flat. He was working for Miles Copeland at the time, who was the manager of the Police and Squeeze. In fact, he produced the first Squeeze album, and he was sort of producing all these punk groups, but he was making these increasingly unhinged records, and you know, doing all this kind of primal screaming and just it's just very, very kind of not exactly cathartic music, because you didn't particularly get the sense that you know, having done this big primal scream, he was in some way going to be purged of his demons. It was more just, it was like he was just being sick. It was just this sickness, you know, coming out of him. And Heartbreak Hotel is one of the great kind of chilling. It's not punk exactly. It's not post-punk. It's just, it's hard to put a label on it. It's just the sound of a man who is just sick to the soul, I suppose, and it's just all splurging out of him, you know. But I mean, there's also some lovely songs on this record as well. You've got Mr. Wilson, which is the opening track, which is a sort of homage to Brian Wilson, and it's got this gorgeous middle section in the middle where it goes into this kind of fairground kind of ambience. It's just brilliant. Taking It All Away is just a great kind of power pop song. And then there's a kind of like rock and roll section. Dirty Ass Rock and Roll is just a great rock song. And Darling, I Need You, it's like an old New Orleans thing. It's just really great, kind of underrated record, really. You know, the two albums that people always talk about with John Cale are Fear, you know, which is a great album, and also Paris 1919 as well, which was the one he did with Chris Thomas, which is very kind of orchestral and very nice, and very nice sounding. But this one is definitely quite kind of unhinged. Is there bad blood between Genesis 3 and Steve Hackett, Richard says. And Calm says, love his Private Parts series. Don't know that, Calm. I shall check that out. Richard, no, as far as I'm aware, there is no specific bad blood between any of the members of Genesis, but I think it's kind of largely accepted now that that a five-piece thing is never going to happen. You know, I think there's too much water under the bridge, and I just don't think that would ever happen. Gavin, I got into Lamont Young and Steve Reich through John Cale and Lou Reed. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, Cale's story is really, really interesting. I've got his book here, actually, which happens to be within arm's reach as well, which is good. This is John Cale's autobiography, which he published back in probably the early noughties or the 90s. It's a fairly pretentious book. It's kind of like thick cardboard. It's really strange, and it's got some quite nice pictures, and it's got some interesting graphic stuff in it, like these kind of pictures. I mean, his story is really, really interesting. You know, the way he came from the Welsh valleys, where he kind of escaped, went to New York in order to study avant-garde composition. And he just stumbled into the orbit of this young punk, you know, Lou Reed. And just what an incredible story that is, you know. Absolutely amazing. Summer Night City. I'm losing the thread now. Goodness gracious. Here's me talking about John Cale, and you lot are talking about the Wombles. Honestly, I'm wasted on you. Wasted on you. I actually am a fan of the Wombles myself. What about this one? Donald Fagen and the Nightfly. This is, apparently this is one of the first ever, if not the first album to be recorded in digital. Have I got that wrong? Came out after Gaucho, which is the last Steely Dan album before they split up. And very, very clean album, very polished, airbrushed, I suppose you'd describe it. Very, very clean sound, you know, immaculate kind of hi-fi definition. Robbie talking about this one? Yeah. IGY, one of the great all-time album openers. It's interesting. I think when people heard this record, they maybe finally understood the extent to which the Steely Dan sound had been defined by Donald Fagen. That's not to put down Walter Becker at all, but it does sound like a Steely Dan record. Let's not beat around the bush. And when Steely Dan did finally reconvene back in the late 80s or early 90s, the music they made did sound like this. I think this sort of laid down the template really for what Steely Dan were going to do later on. I love that cover. I did a whole video on this album a couple of years ago and talked quite extensively on that about this album cover and how it was put together. I love the back as well. Yeah, Alan, I do know people who don't like this record as well. Are you referring to, it's kind of like surface detail? It's difficult sometimes to find much emotional depth in it. There was a thing with Steely Dan, I always thought, where there was a kind of there was a sort of angsty thing going on under the surface. It was all smooth and it was all kind of nice sounding, almost a bit wine bar at times. But the lyrics had a kind of, I don't know, there was a sort of lonely quality to it, or a sort of just an emotional, there was an emotional range to the music, which meant you could kind of scratch and go down into the, into their world, I suppose. And this record, it's quite kind of, it sounds a bit pleased with itself, I think, on occasion. It sounds like he's got so totally into the world of arrangements and just making everything sound so pristine. Maybe it misses just that level of emotional stuff which went on in Steely Dan. I mean, are you a fan of Steely Dan, Alan? That's the big question. Because if you're not, yeah, the smoothness of the production repels me. It's interesting, this thing about smooth production. It does repel certain people. So I know Headley, another fat bearded man talking about records, he totally hates this record. And having spoken to him as well about certain other records, I know that he has this thing as well about smooth production, the kind of yacht rock thing. And I've never had a problem with it. That's not to say that I don't sometimes think, yeah, this record lacks a bit of soul or it lacks a bit of grit. But I've always enjoyed that kind of truly immaculate sounding sort of yacht rock thing. I can just get off on it. My ears are quite happy to bask in that kind of thing. There was a record I bought recently. Let's see if I can find it. And I did talk about it. Let's see if I can find it. You need to thin out this inbox. So, Alan, I would imagine that this is another one that you would really hate. This is the Doobie Brothers and Living on the Fault Line, which is one of their later ones. David, which three Beatles albums had more than one? Question for you all. Which three Beatles albums had more than one image of all the Beatles on the front cover? Sgt. Pepper, that would have been, wouldn't it? Sgt. Pepper? Rob, I don't like it for the production, just like the overall feel of the record. Some 80s albums are smooth vibe, but no substance. Yeah, so smooth vibe, no substance. That's quite a good definition of the Doobie Brothers, maybe, the later Doobie Brothers. And most people talk about the early Doobie Brothers as being this great kind of American rock band, and then they went into a more sort of yacht rock thing with Michael McDonald, and then they stopped being worth listening to. But I actually prefer the yacht rock era of the Doobie Brothers to the early rock stuff, because the early rock stuff that they did actually sounds quite polite, and it's not like Leonard Skinner. There's I don't know, just a sort of politeness to it. And you can hear the seeds of yacht rock trying to get out, but they haven't really taken it to the furthest extent that they could. And when you get into the later sort of yacht rock years, to me, you sort of hear finally what the Doobie Brothers were always meant to do, which was just make this incredibly shiny, creamy, fondanty kind of just absolute ear candy. And there's no point listening to it going, well, this this isn't very rough around the edges. Well, no, it's not. It's classic late 1970s yacht rock. And I totally get it, you know, that some people are they just can't stand that kind of sound, but I'm quite happy to, I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want to just have that in my musical diet forever. I don't just want to listen to yacht rock. But while it's playing, I can absolutely just, you know, get down with it. I love it. Help, Revolver, Hard Day's Night, Hard Day's Night. Okay, so I was wrong about Sgt. Pepper, was I, David? More than one image of all the Beatles on the front cover. Okay. Goodness me, it's like pop quiz territory. Well, talking about the Beatles, let's have a look at Ringo Starr now then. I acquired this recently from a friend who was getting rid of a big load of records, and this is an album I would never have picked up on vinyl. I was aware of its reputation, and you know, I'm not a fan of Ringo Starr. It sounds terrible to admit it. I'm a massive Beatles fan. Do I think he was a great drummer in the Beatles? Yes, I do. Am I going to get all of his solo albums? No, I'm not. And this one is the one that he made, I think, when he was at the depths of his alcoholism. It contains the song Drumming Is My Madness, which is a pretty embarrassing song, really. And it sort of ends with him literally just yelling and shouting and just shouting at the audience, going, I know you want me to stop. I want to stop too. And oh no, it really is. It's just embarrassing, you know. Having said that, it's probably not as bad as people make it out to be. You know, it's, as with all these records, they get this terrible reputation, but when you go back to them, you know, it's not irredeemably awful, but it's you know, it's not it's not good, is it? Stop and Smell the Roses by Ringo Starr is not a classic album. Keith Richards, anybody? His first solo album. Very stripped back to the bone, very rhythmical sounding records. The songs are hardly songs at all, really. They're just kind of riffs and ideas, and it's quite an interesting record. It's quite minimal sounding, you know. When the Stones had that awful period in the 1980s where they sort of broke up, Mick Jagger went off and he tried to do Stones music, but calling it Mick Jagger. And Keith was really furious with him because Mick had decided that he didn't need the Stones anymore and he was just going to go off and be Mick Jagger. But he made a couple of records which I think to Keith's ears, they just sounded like Stones albums, but with Mick, you know, not with the Stones. And he said he couldn't understand it. Keith couldn't understand why Mick had done that. And Keith did this record which couldn't really have been made by the Stones. It was the Stones, but it was boiled down to their absolute essence. It was just all the Jagger stuff stripped away, the tunes and the melodies stripped away. You just had that kind of very hard rhythm and blues kind of sound. Also, it was quite African in places as well, and a bit reggae, a bit kind of dub reggae. He was really into the dub reggae scene, and just the way this album was mixed and recorded, it had a kind of quite a spacious, dubby kind of quality to it. And like I said, the songs are not very memorable. Decent album, Richard, absolutely, yeah. Oh, hello, Steve, good morning to you. A very dreary day in Michigan. Yeah, it's actually quite nice here. Sure, no, I don't have the album that Jagger did with Dave Stewart. What was that called? No, in fact, I've never bought any of Mick Jagger's solo albums. They don't really interest me, really. Maybe because of what Keith has said about them over the years, but that's quite a good record. I actually quite like that. That's good. We are getting through the pile. I think I'll leave that one. I don't have too much to say about that at the moment. Almost at the end of my pile here, actually. Let's do this as the last one for this morning. This is Julian Cope and Peggy Suicide, which I did revisit recently on CD. Bit of a monster, bit of a beast of an album, this. This came out in, was it the early 1990s? I had a cassette single of the single Beautiful Love. And people talk about their Desert Island discs, and to me that one is absolutely up there. I just absolutely love it. I wish I knew where my cassette single of it is, because it was a really good little thing. I remember I used to just play it in the car all the time. Really, really, really great pop song. It doesn't particularly go with the rest of the record, because the rest of the album is actually quite it's quite dark and rocky, this album, really. There's a definite kind of slightly strange, disquieting atmosphere to it. It had a very environmental theme. You know, he was big into all that kind of stuff. So there's the Stonehenge picture on the back. Of course, Julian Cope is a huge expert in megalithic history, you know, ancient Britain and everything, as well as being an expert in Japanese rock and krautrock and all this. You know, really, really interesting character. I'd love to see him live. Peggy Suicide, fantastic stuff. Right, so I've got down to the end of my pile, so let's see where we are here. So Beautiful Love, Richard, absolutely. Yeah, great song. Now, have I not said hello to anybody that's here? I hope I have said hello to everybody. So I make it 1:45 now. Is that right? Or have the clock's gone forward and it's now 1:45? I'm losing the plot. World Shut Your Mouth, big hit in the US, but otherwise he seems to have struggled on our shores. Yeah, I don't think he ever particularly took off in the States, did he? All right, folks, I'm going to leave it there for now. Hope you enjoyed this mega ramble, and I'll be back soon. Much appreciated, and take care. See you, folks. Bye-bye.